Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. We'll guide you through the ups and downs of note investing and teach you all about the nitty-gritty details of the business that other people won't talk about. Your host, Dan Deppen, is a former aerospace engineer and product manager who transitioned away from cubicle life to full-time note investing in 2018. Our website is www.fusionnotes.com, where you can subscribe to this podcast, comment, and find links to other information on note investing.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Deppen, and in this episode, I'm going to talk about how to be a good note seller, and then also when you're buying, what to look for in a note seller, because there are many different types, some good, some not so good. But before I get into that, so this episode should be coming out September 22nd. I'm recording this about a week prior to that, and we're starting to get into a little bit of the home stretch of the year already, even though it's September. We'll pretty soon here be in the fourth quarter. And if you talk to a lot of people, they'll tell you that more note inventory hits the market in the fourth quarter. Some years I have found that to be true. Other years, not so much. This year with COVID and just all the general insanity surrounding 2020, God only knows what this year is going to look like. But I want to start teeing you folks up to take advantage if deals do show up at the end of the year. Some of the note trading that's been going on has been sort of tamped down. I would say note trading has been less active over the last maybe 6 months or so than what it would normally be. And so it seems like there's a possibility that things could loosen up at the end of the year. I think that's most likely going to be the case. Of course, this is a wacky year, so maybe nothing happens in the fourth quarter and the opportunities come later, but I want folks to be ready if the opportunities show up and reveal themselves. So I'm going to be doing a few different things over the next month and a half or so. Some of it is this podcast to let people know what to look for in sellers, because there are some bad actors out there lurking in the industry. I'm also adding some content to my due diligence online training course, Systematic Due Diligence, and I'm going to kind of relaunch that in a way. I'm not really changing the pricing or changing the core offering too much, but I'm adding some additional content that I think will be helpful as we get into the end of the year, and some other bonuses and things as well. So stay tuned for that. That'll be coming out, I don't know, at some point in the coming weeks. But for today, let's talk about being a good note seller. So I kind of put note sellers, I like to put things into buckets. If you've been following this for a while, you probably can tell that. But, so I'd say there are crooks, disorganized people, and then the good note sellers. The crooks are the people who will try to sell you a bad note, who basically rob you, who would, take money directly from your bank account if they could. The disorganized people are the people who aren't bad people, but because they don't keep their stuff straight, it can pose problems when you try to buy a note from them, and there can be a lot of extra due diligence things you need to check on. And then there's like the Mary Poppins, like good note sellers, practically perfect in every way, which the reality is no one is, because notes are complicated and things happen, but I'll get into that. But I'll first start by talking about the crooks, and this is something to watch out for, especially if you're new to the note business, because there are, a number of people who will show up and try to sell you a bad loan, and they will specifically often try to target people who are maybe new to the industry and aren't going to catch some obvious flaws. So one of the aspects of loans that the crooks will try to offload onto you are notes with fatal title flaws, where you're not going to be able to get clean title to the property, or the other thing that's quite popular, you see a lot of very stale loans where the loan might be 10 years behind or 8 years behind. And sometimes might be beyond the statute of limitations where it's not even enforceable and you can't foreclose on it. Oftentimes, they'll try to sell notes on properties that are trashed. I haven't actually seen this one myself, but I know other people who have, got offers accepted on notes and looked into them and found out that the property was actually demoed and there was actually no house there. There was just an empty lot. Delinquent taxes are common, and having delinquent taxes is not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes there are really large amounts of delinquent taxes. So a lot of times the crooks will show up with loans where, borrower hasn't made a payment in 8 years and they haven't paid the taxes, and it's basically overdue to go to tax sale. And they're just kind of hoping you don't notice that, and if you don't, then you could buy the note and then potentially lose the property right away. In some cases, they'll try to sell notes that are already lost at tax sale. And my big pet peeve, the other one you run into, is in the pricing they ask for. They will often ask for pricing that just doesn't make any sense. And one of the big ones, and it's a red flag, is they will try to tell you that, hey, there's a lot of equity in this note, and so even though the unpaid balance is $30,000, the property is worth $100,000, so I'm going to price it based on that $100,000. And you can scoop that equity when you foreclose. Well, a forfeiture is a little different, but in a foreclosure, once you go to sheriff auction, if that house is really worth $100,000 and it sells for $100,000 and your payoff amount is $30,000, you're getting $30,000. You can't collect more than the payoff amount there. So basically everybody knows this, who's been around. So if someone is claiming that they're a reputable seller and they're, really insisting that it works the other way around, that's a really bad sign. Some other red flags to watch for is when they have a loan that hasn't been paid on in a long time, very delinquent, maybe 6 years delinquent, and they try to tell you, oh, well, this will be easy for you to handle. You can just foreclose. Look, this is a non-judicial state, and it's really super fast. But yet, they haven't done it themselves, and no one else has done it. So if you have a loan that's just kind of sat stale and no one's done anything with it, there's often a reason. And that reason could be that there's a fatal title flaw that they can't fix, so they can't do it, or the statute of limitations has run out and they can't proceed with that foreclosure, or the property is just so trashed it's not even worth the legal fees to go through the foreclosure. So there's generally a reason. Now, I have found loans sometimes in larger funds where, if you got a fund that's got hundreds and thousands of loans, some of them can get kind of lost in the shuffle where they're aware of it, but they just don't have time to deal with it because they're dealing with other aspects of their portfolio. That can be the case sometimes, but usually this means something's wrong. Another red flag is when you find some obvious problem that they didn't disclose. Like, for example, hey, there are $12,000 in delinquent taxes on this property. Or, hey, this property was already lost at a tax sale. I see these kinds of things all the time. Or if they just say anything else, like I gave the example of, when a seller tries to say that you can collect all the equity at a sheriff sale, sometimes they just say other kinds of things that don't really make any sense and pass the sniff test. Then the other general thing to watch out for is just unreasonable pricing asks. People asking for 100% of UPB or even higher in some cases. There actually are loans that exist in the market that can sell at that price, but they're generally not the kind of loans that we see, and there's definitely not, sub $100,000 non-performing type stuff. And then the other thing is you also want to make sure that the person you're dealing with actually owns the loan, right? If you look up who owns the loan, and it's not them or they don't have a story for why that is, that's always a red flag as well. And in my due diligence course, I go into details showing how to pull that up. And maybe that's a topic I can cover on the podcast as well at another time. Another red flag is when they send you a tape and the data is really stale. So if they're sending you a tape and the data was last updated 6 months ago or even longer, sometimes that means they probably don't own the loan. The tape's being passed around. Or they do own it. They put this together 6 months ago. They sent it out. And the assets were fatally flawed and no one bought them. And they're just kind of taking a flyer. Hey, I'll send it to this person and maybe they'll make me an offer. And then the other big one that you see commonly is when they claim BPO values that just make no sense whatsoever. I mean, you always need to be, no matter who the seller is, you always want to verify the BPO value yourself. Get eyes on the property at the time you're selling. So even if it's a credible seller, right? May have bought the note 2 years ago and the property may have been in good shape, and that could have changed since then, and they may not even know. Excuse me, potentially. So you always want to get your own BPO values anyway. However, if they're trying to tell you that a property is worth $125,000 and Zillow says it's worth $50,000, we all know Zillow tends to be kind of high. Anyways, something's really, really wrong there. If they're giving you data that just doesn't make sense, it suggests they just kind of made it up and threw it on a tape. So those are some of the red flags to look out for. If you run into these, it's possible you're dealing with a crook. Doesn't mean you absolutely are, but it's a possibility, and there's certainly too many of them out there. And especially, too, as we get into this end of the year I was talking about, you often see new assets hit the market, but you also tend to see a lot of that year's recycled tape. So a lot of like the garbage assets that floated around during that year all kind of show up again at the end. Okay, the second bucket I put are people that are not necessarily crooks, but I call them disorganized people. So in note investing, really to me, note investing is all about being able to handle a lot of details. And just not everybody either has the ability or the stomach for it. I think it takes kind of a certain personality type to really keep that stuff under control. And in reality, we are all disorganized to some amount or another. I know for myself personally, I have let things fall through the cracks at different points. And then my response to that is typically to update some of my standard operating procedures and processes. So over time, those get better. And the number of things falling through the cracks goes down over time. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human and this stuff does kind of happen. But some people are a lot more disorganized than others. So what you might run into if you're trying to buy a note from someone who I would put in the disorganized bucket would be, maybe when they bought the note, they had assignments and deeds and things that were never recorded, or maybe the borrowers got delinquent on taxes and they didn't notice. I've had sellers forget to send me the hard collateral files after the sale. It's usually not a big deal. You just got to follow up with them afterwards and get them to send that to you. Or sometimes I run into little minor title flaws that they missed when they bought the loan. And it's not that they were trying to hide a flaw or anything like that other bucket of folks I was just talking about. But, sometimes there's little things, and sometimes even attorneys have different interpretations. So you can run into little things. You just need to work through that and get the deal closed. And if they're a good seller and a good counterparty, they're going to work with you to get this stuff straightened out. So what would the good note sellers look like? And this is like the, like I said, like the Mary Poppins kind of perfect world. Nobody is, perfect on this stuff across the board. I know I'm not. But one thing is basically their notes are going to tend to be clean. You're not going to run into title issues. You're not going to run into pending tax sales and things like that. And if there are issues with the note or problems or maybe valuation problems, they're going to tend to point those out up front. Because really, as a seller, and part of my motivation, I didn't mention, but part of my what got me thinking about this topic is I'm in the process of getting ready to sell some notes. I'll be listing some of them on PaperStack maybe before or just after this podcast comes out. But generally, if there are any issues with the note, the seller will hopefully be able to point those out up front. Because as the seller, if there's some issue where, the borrower, let's say they were a spotty payer or there was some hiccup in the pay history or something, you want the potential buyer to know that stuff before they make an offer, right? There's no point in putting something out for sale, not disclosing an issue, and then having a buyer make an offer, you accept it, they do their due diligence, and then they end up backing out because of this issue that came up. You'd rather have all that out up front. And then if anything does come up, the seller should work with you to resolve any of those issues. So I had a case just recently where there were some tile issues that needed to be cleared and some other odds and ends. And, I told the seller, okay, we need to get these things cleaned up first. He worked to get those cleaned up, kept me in the loop. And then once all those got taken care of, then we closed the sale. So, and then the other thing I'll say is that if they're selling a non-performer, generally they should be able to give some reason why they didn't work it out themselves. Now, they're not necessarily going to put this on the tape, but if you ask, like, hey, what's going on with this? What's the story? If they just throw their arms up, that looks kind of weird, right? Like, if someone's selling a non-performer, especially if it's really, really non-performing, and they never did anything with it, right? That kind of suggests something might be wrong. However, people have great reasons to sell non-performers all the time. Sometimes it could be that they bought a larger pool of notes, and in that pool they had the ones that they wanted to keep in their portfolio and they wanted to work. And then maybe they're parsing off some of the other ones, maybe because it doesn't really fit their model. Maybe part of their plan for purchasing the pool was, we're going to buy this pool because we care about this group of notes, and then we're going to sell off this other group to help recover some of our costs. It could be that they have an investor that they work with who wants to cash out some of the money, either from a fund or it could be on an individual joint venture. It could be that they're just kind of giving up on it, right? It could be that they, because I've had some loans kind of in this bucket where the borrower never quite defaults, but then never quite gets consistent either, and eventually say, okay, I'm going to cash this out and move to the next one. So like I said, they're not necessarily going to put the reason for selling on the tape. I don't think it's reasonable to always ask that. But if you call them or talk to them and say, hey, what's going on with this, they should be able to have some reason. Because I've literally had people just kind of hunch their shoulders and go, I don't know, it's just for sale. And then you look at it and you realize they're getting rid of it because it's not worth anything. And then the other thing is being able to provide collateral, right? And generally, access to the collateral files is given after an offer is made. So generally the process is somebody sends out a tape. It's got a certain amount of information. Sometimes the borrowers will include BPOs and occasionally O&E reports with that. But usually for me, I just send out the data on the tape. And then if the seller requests collateral, I'll send it to them. When I list things on PaperStack, I often just upload the collateral because it just kind of makes life easy. And they kind of give you an easy way to do that, right? If I'm selling something myself, then it becomes this email insanity trying to keep track of who I sent collateral to and who I didn't and things like that. But if it's somebody that I know and I know they're a credible buyer and they say, hey, I'd like to see the collateral file before I put together this offer, then I'll usually provide them a link to that as well. If you ask about it and the borrower and the seller has a hard time providing all the collateral, or you made an offer and they've accepted it, and it's taken them a while to get you the soft copies of the files. And when I say provide the collateral, I mean providing access to the soft copies, not the hard copies. You don't get the hard copies until you close, obviously. But if they're kind of slow to produce that, or stuff is missing and you have to keep going back at them, that can be a little bit of a red flag as well. Another thing good note sellers will do is be able to back up or BPO values. So, if you're listing on a tape, hey, my BPO value is X, they should be able to provide a copy of that BPO and the date that it was pulled. Now, it could be that their BPO is wrong because they pulled it a couple years ago and things have changed in that neighborhood, or the condition of the property's changed. Who knows? But they should be able to provide some data. I mean, a lot of times I see bad sellers just throw in a number that makes no sense and with no backup, and then I just kind of disregard that. The other thing is that the good note sellers will provide current data on the loans. So one of the challenges when you're going to sell loans is, you put together a tape, you pull all the updated pay history and everything from your loan servicer's portal and fill it in. And then sometimes a lot of time goes by where you might put together this tape, but then you're waiting to get data on other loans. Then a few days go by before you get all the data together. You send it out. Maybe you get some offers, and then maybe a seller backs out, so you put it back out on the market, and now a few weeks have gone by, and then you got to go back to the loan servicer's portal and kind of update anything because maybe a payment's come in by then or something's changed. And from the seller perspective, it's kind of a pain in the butt to keep up with some of that. But I do see a lot of tapes where the data is like a couple months old. And that's just no good, especially if it's a performing note or a close to performing note. Having the up-to-date pay history really matters. So if someone's expecting you to make offers and close on things where the data they're giving you is 3 months old, that's not real great. I have seen credible note sellers do that just because they were kind of lazy or whatever, but ideally they'll be able to give you up-to-date information. In general, too, they should be able to communicate well, and that's kind of a broad term, but what I mean by communicate well is, they get back to you in a reasonable amount of time, right? I mean, typically 24 hours. I don't expect somebody to be on their email all day and respond to me within an hour, but to expect them to get back to me within the next business day. And if I ask a couple questions or there are a couple points in the email, they actually respond to all of them. I've worked. So this gets into a broader topic of like email, how to use email. But as time goes on, I hate email more and more. So I try to consolidate it. So sometimes if I have a couple different issues that I'm discussing with someone, I'll try to contain all of them in the same email, maybe with bullet points or something, just to consolidate. So instead of having 5 email threads with the person, I can just have one. I've worked with some people in the past who, whatever happens, they'll respond to one thing at a time. And that's a pain in the butt. And then things get lost in the shuffle. So, just being able to generally communicate well is good. I know for me personally, as I've become busier over the last few years, my speed of response has definitely slowed down as I've gone to working on my email kind of in batches, maybe 1 or 2 times a day and sometimes just once a day. So apologies to folks if you've contacted me about stuff and I've been a little slow to get back at times, but in general, hopefully they're answering it, I expect them to answer in a reasonable amount of time and cover the points so we can make meaningful progress. The other point for a good note seller is that if they accept an offer, that they honor it, even if a higher offer comes in later. I have had this happen before, where I accepted an offer and then like 30 minutes or a half hour later, gotten a higher offer from or I've gotten an offer, accepted it, and then soon after accepting it, get a higher offer come in. And you always have to honor it in that case, because there are people in the industry who don't do that. There's one guy in particular who's kind of famous for this. I haven't actually bought any notes from him, partly because of his reputation. And the story on this one particular person was, he would pull a note out from under his grandmother if somebody offered 10 cents more. So reputation is obviously very important. That follows you. So if you are selling and you accept an offer, you need to honor it for sure. Now, if you accept it, higher offer comes in, and then the first person starts being kind of pokey and maybe getting flaky, because there are a lot of flaky buyers. I'm okay with kind of pushing them to say, all right, are we doing this or not? Because I do have another offer. That's okay, but you always got to honor it. And then the other thing is, good note sellers will help the borrower out afterwards if they need something. So I have had some cases where there were issues with the way assignments initially got drafted, where you had to change a little thing. So I needed a seller to re-execute an assignment. And most of the sellers are real good about that. In fact, I just did this for someone else recently as well. It doesn't come up that often, but sometimes it does. What you don't want is a seller that's just going to throw their hands up and say, I got the money wired, see you later. That's no good. So those are some of the things that the good note sellers are going to do. So I guess just to kind of wrap this up now, like Jerry Springer, I'll give you my final thoughts on this. Hopefully when it comes to note investing, you're playing a long game and plan on sticking around the industry for a while, hopefully a couple decades. And so, when you're buying and selling and transacting with other folks, it's always important to consider your long-term reputation, because there are, opportunities to take shortcuts, and unfortunately a lot of people try to take them. But one of the nice things about notes, it is a relatively small industry, relatively small number of people who tend to talk to each other, so you can get information on who those folks are. So, just make sure you're playing a long game, I think, and you should do very, very well. So that wraps up this episode of the Note Investor Podcast. I hope that was helpful. You got any questions or other things or ideas for future topics? Always feel free to reach out, and as always, encourage people to subscribe to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Fusion Notes. Been getting a steady flow of new subscribers, and that's great. I'm getting closer to hitting some key thresholds that allow me to do some cool things with the YouTube channel. So thanks, and I will see you next time.